Lightning tears through the darkness above the Black Pacific on that fateful night of March 31st, 1944. Inside the belly of a Kawanishi flying boat, fighting through violent turbulence at 2,000 feet, sits a man who carries the fate of an empire in a leather case pressed tight against his chest. Admiral Manechi Koga feels every shudder of the aircraft as rain batters the hull with the relentless fury of automatic weapons fire. When he peers through the small circular window beside his seat, there's nothing visible except the angry ocean churning below and razor-sharp clouds that burst into momentary brilliance with each flash of electricity splitting the sky. The storm itself doesn't occupy Koga's thoughts. His mind circles endlessly around the papers in that briefcase, documents containing what Japanese naval intelligence considers their final chance at turning the tide of this increasingly difficult war. The Z plan represents months of meticulous work by the brightest strategic minds serving the Emperor. Every calculation has been verified, every assumption tested, every contingency planned for, with the kind of precision that only decades of naval tradition can produce. The Americans will advance from the eastern approaches because that's simply how they operate. They've shown their patterns throughout this conflict. They'll hurl their forces against the fortress islands that Japan has transformed into impregnable strongholds. Places like Jaluit, Mila, Woche and Maloelap have been fortified until they bristle with artillery and house thousands of dedicated troops ready to defend every inch of coral. The American fleet will exhaust itself against these positions, bleeding personnel and resources until they're vulnerable. That's when the combined fleet will strike from its base at Truk, emerging like a blade from the darkness to deliver the decisive blow that will destroy what remains of American naval power in the Pacific. Any reasonable military commander would follow this pattern. You attack the obvious objectives. You fight where your enemy expects battle. You prove your superiority through strength against strength. Koga adjusts the cap bearing the insignia of his rank and stares deeper into the tempest raging outside. At 59 years old, he shoulders a burden that would crush lesser men. Following in the wake of Yamamoto, the brilliant architect behind Pearl Harbor, who had the mercy of dying before defeat became routine, now falls to Koga to somehow extract victory from circumstances that grow more desperate with each passing week. His aide leans close, voice barely cutting through the engine roar. The pilot reports we might need to divert to an alternate landing site. Koga's response is immediate and sharp. There will be no diversions. His tone carries the weight of a lifetime spent preparing for exactly this kind of moment. We continue to Davao according to schedule. The fleet is assembled and waiting for these orders. What Koga cannot possibly know as his aircraft pushes toward what will become its watery tomb is that 600 miles distant, American codebreakers are already reading communications that Japanese High Command believes remain completely secure. Filipino guerrilla fighters have retrieved the Z plan from another crashed aircraft, and United States intelligence officers are currently analyzing every detail of Japan's supposedly perfect strategy. But the truly shocking element isn't this massive intelligence breach. It's what American commanders are planning to do with this information. They're going to completely disregard it. While Admiral Koga sits strapped into that doomed aircraft, absolutely confident that he understands American thinking, American tactics, and the inevitable pattern of their advance against Japan's fortress perimeter, the United States Pacific Fleet is preparing to execute an operation that will demolish not just Japanese defensive positions, but the entire Japanese conceptual framework for understanding modern warfare. The Americans are about to demonstrate that the most powerful weapon in any conflict isn't superior firepower or better fortifications. It's the capacity to render your enemy's entire strategic paradigm completely meaningless. But what could lead the most brilliant naval strategists Japan could produce to make such catastrophic errors in predicting American intentions? To grasp the magnitude of this miscalculation, you need to stand in the worn boots of Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama on a wooden pier extending into the crystalline waters of Kwajalein Atoll on the morning of January 15, 1944. Sunlight dances across the lagoon's surface, and in every direction he can observe the concrete bunkers and gun positions that represent countless hours of grueling construction work. Akiyama commands the 6th Base Force, serving as the operational center for Japanese activities throughout the Marshall Islands. His headquarters on Kwajalein coordinates defensive operations across an island chain stretching hundreds of miles across the Pacific. The responsibility weighs on him constantly, made heavier by the certainty that American forces are coming. Yet Akiyama feels no particular anxiety about Kwajalein's security. Why should he? The strategic situation appears crystal clear. During morning briefings with his staff officers, Akiyama explains his analysis with confidence. The American military mind operates methodically. They will strike Jaluit or Mila first, perhaps Wotja. They lack the creative capacity for any other approach. This isn't mere arrogance speaking. His assessment rests on solid intelligence reports and decades of military experience. The outer Marshall Islands are heavily defended. Jaluit alone houses more than 3,500 troops along with massive coastal artillery. Mila boasts over 2,500 soldiers and some of the finest fortifications anywhere in the Pacific Theatre. These islands form an impenetrable barrier that any rational enemy must neutralize before pushing deeper into Japanese-controlled territory. That's fundamental military doctrine. That's how warfare has functioned throughout history. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles away at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz studies aerial reconnaissance photographs spread across his conference table. His intelligence officers have just completed a briefing that would seem impossible to Japanese strategic planners. The American plan is to bypass every major fortress island and strike directly at the heart of the Marshall Island chain. "Gentlemen," Nimitz announces, his finger tracing a route across the map that skips entirely over Jaluit, Mila and Wotje, "we're proceeding straight to Kwajalein." The silence filling the room is absolute. Even American officers find the audacity of this plan almost beyond belief. Kwajalein isn't merely behind Japanese defensive lines. It serves as the administrative hub for the entire Marshall Island defense network. The comparison would be attacking an enemy's brain while leaving his fists completely intact. But that's precisely the strategic logic. American intelligence has uncovered something the Japanese never expect them to discover. Kwajalein represents the weakest link in the entire defensive chain. While the outer islands have been fortified to an extreme degree, Kwajalein has approximately 1,120 combat-effective troops. The remaining personnel among its 5,000-man garrison consist of Korean labourers, construction workers, and support staff who have never trained for actual combat. Back on Kwajalein, Akiyama confronts problems whose full dimensions he doesn't yet comprehend. His diary entries, later recovered after the battle, reveal a man growing increasingly anxious about American reconnaissance flights that don't follow any logical pattern. The enemy aircraft photograph areas that make no strategic sense whatsoever, he writes on January 20th. Why do they repeatedly photograph our lagoon approaches when our primary defences face the ocean? Their intelligence gathering must be fundamentally flawed. But Akiyama's confusion extends beyond tactical puzzlement. Like every Japanese officer, his training emphasized military traditions that value decisive battle, honor through direct confrontation, and spiritual superiority that comes from accepting the most difficult challenges. The concept that an enemy might simply avoid your strengths doesn't register in his thinking. It's not just unfamiliar, it's almost insulting to fundamental principles of honorable warfare. Consider the Japanese military mindset in early 1944. This represents a warrior culture that produced the samurai tradition, that reveres death over dishonor, that views strategic retreat as cowardice. When Admiral Koga designed the Z Plan, he wasn't merely creating military strategy. He was expressing fundamental Japanese beliefs about how honorable warriors should conduct themselves in conflict. You meet your enemy directly. You fight where the fighting is hardest. You prove your superiority through superior courage, superior discipline, and superior willingness to sacrifice for your cause. The Americans, Japanese commanders believe, must fight this way too, because that's how genuine warfare is conducted by serious military powers. But what if the Americans don't share these cultural beliefs? What if they view war not as a test of spiritual strength, but as a problem requiring the most efficient solution possible? What if they're willing to win ugly, to bypass honor in favor of effectiveness, to let enemy fortresses wither uselessly while striking where defenses are thinnest? On January 29, 1944, American carrier aircraft commenced preliminary bombardment of Japanese positions throughout the Marshall Islands. But instead of concentrating firepower on the outer fortress islands as expected, they hit targets scattered across the entire chain. Akiyama observes from his command bunker as explosions blossom across distant atolls. They're softening up everything simultaneously, his communications officer reports. Jaluit, Mila, Wotje, Majuro, and Sir, they're hitting our positions here as well. Akiyama nods with grim satisfaction. Finally, the Americans are revealing their intentions. This widespread bombing campaign confirms Japanese expectations perfectly. The Americans are preparing for systematic assaults on multiple fortress positions. It will cost them dearly, but at least it follows comprehensible strategic logic. What Akiyama cannot realize is that he's witnessing the most sophisticated deception operation in naval warfare history. The Americans aren't softening targets for invasion. They're concealing their true objectives behind a smokescreen of universal destruction. The real blow arrives tomorrow, and when it falls, everything changes. January 31st, 1944, 5:47 in the morning. The first explosions shatter pre-dawn silence over Kwajalein Atoll like the apocalypse itself. Admiral Akiyama jolts awake in his bunk as his entire command bunker shakes violently. Concrete dust rains from the ceiling in choking clouds. Outside, naval gunfire thunders across the lagoon in continuous, devastating waves. Through the narrow observation slit in his bunker wall, he can see muzzle flashes illuminating the horizon like deadly stars being born. But something about this picture is wrong. Terribly, impossibly wrong. His aide bursts through the bunker door, helmet askew, eyes wide with shock. "Sir, the American fleet, they're not positioned where they should be." Akiyama grabs his binoculars and rushes to the observation post. What he sees through the magnified lenses defies everything he thought he understood about warfare, about Americans, about the fundamental nature of military strategy itself. The United States Pacific Fleet isn't attacking Jaluit. It isn't pounding the massive fortifications at Mila or Wotje. Instead, 8 American battleships are positioned inside the Kwajalein Lagoon, inside his defensive perimeter, methodically destroying everything in sight with the precision of industrial machinery. "How did they penetrate our outer defenses?" Akiyama whispers, his voice barely audible over the bombardment. The answer is as simple as it is revolutionary. They didn't penetrate the outer defenses. They sailed around them entirely. While Japanese commanders spent months preparing for frontal assaults on their fortress islands, the Americans developed something entirely new, a strategy so audacious that it didn't even exist within Japanese military conceptual frameworks. They called it island hopping, though that bland term completely fails to capture the psychological devastation it's about to unleash. The battleship New Mexico opens fire with her 14-inch guns, each shell weighing as much as a small automobile. The first salvo brackets the main command bunker. The second finds its range perfectly. Akiyama watches in horrified fascination as his carefully constructed defensive positions simply cease to exist under the methodical American bombardment. But the naval gunfire is merely the opening act. At 6:15 in the morning, the sky fills with the drone of aircraft engines. Not the handful of planes that might support a traditional amphibious assault, but wave after wave of carrier aircraft. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters. More aircraft than Akiyama has ever seen in his entire life concentrated in one place. Lieutenant Commander Toshio Nabata, stationed at the airfield, records what happens next in his diary. The enemy planes emerged from the sun like a plague of locusts. Our fighters attempted to respond, but they were outnumbered 20-1. I watched zero after zero fall burning into the lagoon until there were no more zeros left to fall. By 7 in the morning, 92 of the 110 Japanese aircraft in the Marshall Islands have been destroyed. The remainder flee to distant bases, leaving the island garrisons completely defenseless against air attack. This is the moment when Japanese strategic thinking doesn't just fail, it shatters completely. You have to understand, every Japanese plan for defending the Marshall Islands was predicated on the assumption that Americans would fight for honor. They would attack the strongest points first, seeking decisive battle, accepting massive casualties for the glory of direct confrontation. The outer fortress islands were designed to attract American attention, to draw them into grinding attritional warfare where Japanese spiritual superiority could triumph over American material advantages. Instead, the Americans treated Japanese fortress islands like obstacles to be avoided. They left 11,000 Japanese troops on the outer islands to wither uselessly, starving, cut off from supplies, militarily irrelevant, while striking at the single point where Japanese defenses were thinnest. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders is immediate and devastating. Colonel Tarukichi Aso, commanding the 729 men of the Kwajalein detachment who had just arrived on Kwajalein for transfer, stares at the American fleet through his field glasses. "This is not warfare," he mutters to his aide. "This is something else entirely." What Aso is witnessing is the birth of modern asymmetric warfare. The revolutionary idea that victory comes not from defeating the enemy's strength, but from making his strength irrelevant. At 9:30 in the morning, the first American landing craft hit the beaches. Major General Charles Corlett's 7th Infantry Division doesn't charge into withering defensive fire like the Marines experienced at Tarawa. Instead, they wade ashore on beaches that have been so thoroughly pulverized by naval gunfire that one British observer later wrote that nothing could have possibly lived through that sea and air bombardment. The beach was a mass of highly coloured fish that had been thrown up there by nearby explosions. The prepared Japanese defences, the gun positions, the concrete bunkers, the carefully sited machine gun nests have been reduced to rubble and smoking craters. Most of the Korean labourers and support personnel surrender immediately, having never expected to participate in combat at all. But it's not just the physical destruction that breaks Japanese resistance. It's the complete psychological disorientation of fighting an enemy who refuses to follow the rules. Akiyama retreats to his final command bunker, trying desperately to coordinate a defense against an attack that shouldn't be happening according to all strategic doctrine. His radio crackles with confused reports from his surviving units. "Sir, the Americans have landed at 3 different points simultaneously. They're using some kind of amphibious tanks. We've never seen anything like them. Our coastal guns can't depress low enough to hit their landing craft in the lagoon. Every defensive plan, every carefully prepared position, every tactical doctrine developed over decades of military training has become useless overnight. The Americans aren't just winning. They're winning so easily that Japanese resistance collapses into bewildered chaos." By noon, American forces have advanced halfway across Kwajalein Island. By evening, organized Japanese resistance has effectively ended. In less than 18 hours, the administrative center of Japanese power in the Marshall Islands has fallen to an enemy attack that Japanese strategic doctrine insisted was impossible. The numbers tell their own devastating story. Out of 5,000 Japanese personnel on Kwajalein, only 265 survive as prisoners. American casualties number just 177 killed and 1,000 wounded. It's not a battle in the traditional sense. It's a systematic demolition carried out with industrial efficiency. But perhaps the most shocking moment comes when Akiyama, wounded and trapped in his final bunker, realizes that the Americans aren't even planning to attack the fortress islands at all. Radio intercepts reveal that Jaluit, Mila and Kwajalein, the supposedly critical defensive positions that absorbed so much Japanese effort and resources, are simply being bypassed completely. 11,000 Japanese soldiers will spend the rest of the war sitting on heavily fortified islands that no longer matter to anyone strategically. As American soldiers finally breach his command bunker, Akiyama experiences something no Japanese officer had ever been trained to process: the complete irrelevance of everything he thought he knew about warfare. The Americans hadn't just defeated Japanese defenses, they had made Japanese defenses meaningless. Standing in the smoking ruins of his command post, surrounded by American soldiers who look more like factory workers than samurai warriors, Akiyama understands with crystal clarity that this is not just a tactical defeat. It's the end of an entire way of thinking about war, honor, and the nature of military conflict itself. The age of fortress warfare, of meeting strength with strength, of proving superiority through direct confrontation, dies with him in that bunker on Kwajalein Atoll. What's being born in its place will reshape not just the Pacific War, but the entire future of global conflict for generations to come. The silence in Admiral Suemu Toyoda's office in Tokyo is deafening. It's February 8, 1944, 1 week after the fall of Kwajalein, and Toyoda, newly appointed to replace the deceased Admiral Koga, stares at intelligence reports that read like science fiction. The Americans have captured the heart of the Marshall Island Defense Network in 4 days. 11,000 Japanese troops remain stranded on outer islands that the Americans simply ignored. The entire strategic framework of Japanese Pacific defense has collapsed like a house of cards. How? Toyoda asks his intelligence officer. How did we miss this so completely? The answer sits in a manila folder on his desk. The captured Z plan that Filipino guerrillas had fished from a crashed aircraft months earlier. Every Japanese defensive position, every strategic assumption, every tactical doctrine had been laid bare to American intelligence. But even more devastating than this intelligence failure was the deeper psychological blindness it revealed. Japanese military thinking had become trapped in its own cultural assumptions. The belief that honor required meeting enemy strength directly. The conviction that Americans would fight like Japanese, seeking decisive battle where defenses were strongest. The inability to conceive that an enemy might simply walk away from your strengths to strike at your weaknesses. For surviving Japanese commanders like Toyoda, the shock was transformational and permanent. Post-war interrogations reveal officers who described feeling like they had been fighting ghosts, an enemy that refused to behave predictably, that treated war as an engineering problem rather than a test of spiritual strength. Lieutenant Commander Nabata, one of the few survivors from Kwajalein's airfield, later wrote that they spent months preparing for the wrong war. While we built fortresses, they built flexibility. While we concentrated forces, they concentrated intelligence. While we prepared for battle, they prepared to avoid battle entirely. The psychological impact rippled throughout the Japanese military hierarchy. Field commanders began second-guessing every defensive plan. Was this position too obvious? Would the Americans simply bypass it? How do you defend against an enemy that refuses to attack your defenses? But the Americans weren't finished revolutionizing warfare. What happened in the Marshalls was just the beginning. Over the following months, United States forces would leapfrog across the Pacific with devastating efficiency. The Mariana Islands fell in summer 1944, bringing B-29 bombers within range of Japan itself. The Philippines were reconquered through a combination of amphibious assaults and brilliant tactical bypassing of Japanese strongpoints. Each victory validated the new American way of war. Strike where the enemy is weakest. Make his strengths irrelevant. Win through superior intelligence and operational flexibility rather than superior courage alone. The human cost of Japanese strategic miscalculation was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers found themselves marooned on bypassed islands, slowly starving while the war moved past them. They had been prepared to die gloriously in battle. Instead, they died slowly and pointlessly, victims of a strategic doctrine that had been rendered obsolete overnight. Today, military strategists study the Marshall Islands campaign as the birth of modern asymmetric warfare. The principles pioneered by American forces in 1944 – avoid enemy strengths, exploit intelligence advantages, prioritize operational speed over tactical perfectionism – became the foundation for everything from Cold War proxy conflicts to contemporary counter-terrorism operations. But perhaps the most important lesson is psychological rather than tactical. The Japanese commanders who were so shocked by American island hopping weren't stupid or incompetent. They were trapped by their own cultural assumptions about how wars should be fought, how enemies should behave, how honor and effectiveness should balance against each other. In boardrooms and military academies around the world, the story of Japanese strategic blindness has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumption-based planning. How many businesses have failed by assuming competitors would follow traditional patterns? How many military campaigns have crumbled when enemies refused to fight the expected battle? The storm that claimed Admiral Koga's life on March 31, 1944, was more than just a meteorological accident. It was symbolic of the tempest that American strategic innovation was about to unleash across the Pacific. Japanese commanders had prepared for everything except an enemy that would change the rules of war itself. Standing in the ruins of Kwajalein Atoll, surrounded by the debris of obsolete defensive thinking, the age of fortress warfare was ending. The age of maneuver warfare, information warfare, and strategic flexibility had begun. The Americans hadn't just shocked Japanese commanders with their island-hopping strategy. They had shocked the world into a new understanding of what warfare could become when intelligence, innovation, and audacity combined to make the impossible inevitable. Understanding how the rules changed then might just save your future tomorrow, because the principles that shattered Japanese strategic thinking in 1944 continue to reshape conflicts and competitions in our modern world. The capacity to see beyond conventional wisdom, to recognize when cherished assumptions have become liabilities, to adapt faster than your opponent can react, these remain the most powerful weapons in any competitive endeavor. The deeper you examine what happened in those crucial days of late January and early February 1944, the more profound the lessons become. This wasn't simply a matter of Americans having better equipment or more resources, though both certainly helped. The fundamental shift was conceptual. Japanese military planners had constructed an entire edifice of strategic thought built on assumptions about how their enemy would behave, and when those assumptions proved false, the entire structure collapsed. Consider the mindset of those 11,000 Japanese troops stranded on the outer fortress islands. They had trained for months, perhaps years, for the decisive battle that would come when American forces threw themselves against Japanese defensive positions. They had prepared psychologically for the ultimate test of their warrior spirit. They had accepted that they would likely die, but they would die in glorious combat, taking as many enemies with them as possible. Instead, they watched American ships sail past their islands. They heard distant thunder of combat at Kwajalein. They received fragmentary radio reports of the swift American victory, and then silence. No battle came, no American assault materialized. They were simply irrelevant. For warriors trained in a tradition that emphasized honorable death in combat, this fate was perhaps worse than any battlefield defeat. They hadn't been defeated. They had been ignored. The psychological warfare aspect of island hopping was perhaps as important as its tactical advantages. Every bypassed Japanese garrison became a demonstration of American strategic superiority. Every ignored fortress island sent a message that reverberated throughout the Japanese military hierarchy. Your defenses don't matter. Your prepared positions are meaningless. We will fight where and when we choose, and you cannot force us to engage on your terms. This represented a fundamental power shift in the Pacific War. Prior to Kwajalein, Japanese forces could at least dictate where battles would occur by choosing defensive positions and forcing Americans to attack those positions or abandon their strategic objectives. After Kwajalein, Americans demonstrated they could achieve their strategic objectives while completely bypassing Japanese defensive preparations. The intelligence dimension cannot be overstated. The captured Z plan gave Americans unprecedented insight into Japanese strategic thinking, but more importantly, it revealed the rigidity of that thinking. Japanese plans were meticulously detailed, thoroughly considered, and completely inflexible. They assumed American behavior would conform to Japanese expectations. When it didn't, there was no backup plan, no alternative framework, no conceptual flexibility to adapt to the unexpected. American planning, by contrast, emphasized adaptability. Intelligence gathering wasn't just about discovering enemy positions. It was about understanding enemy assumptions and finding ways to violate those assumptions. The extensive aerial reconnaissance that so puzzled Admiral Akiyama wasn't faulty intelligence gathering. It was Americans systematically mapping every possible approach, every potential weakness, preparing multiple options for attack. The technological dimension also deserves examination. American amphibious warfare capabilities had evolved dramatically since the early days of the Pacific Campaign. The landing craft, amphibious tanks, and specialized equipment that so confused Japanese defenders represented years of innovation and development. Americans had transformed amphibious assault from a desperately risky operation into a systematic, almost industrial process. But technology alone doesn't explain the outcome. The Japanese had excellent artillery, strong fortifications, and dedicated troops. What they lacked was the conceptual framework to use these assets effectively against an enemy that refused to fight the expected battle. Their guns were sighted to repel attacks from the ocean. The Americans attacked from the lagoon. Their defensive positions were oriented toward the outer approaches. The Americans came from behind. Their entire tactical doctrine assumed enemies would advance gradually through the island chain. The Americans leapfrogged over most of it. The naval gunfire demonstration at Kwajalein also revealed another asymmetry. American battleships could sit offshore and methodically destroy defensive positions with minimal risk to themselves. Japanese coastal artillery was designed for direct fire against approaching ships, not for dueling with battleships at extended ranges. The 8 American battleships in Kwajalein Lagoon could deliver overwhelming firepower while remaining effectively invulnerable to Japanese counterattack. The air superiority dimension was equally decisive. Once American fighters had swept Japanese aircraft from the skies, the islands were completely defenseless against air attack. Japanese garrisons could do nothing but huddle in bunkers while wave after wave of American aircraft delivered ordnance with precision. The psychological impact of this helplessness, of being unable to even contest American air supremacy, further demoralized Japanese defenders. The speed of the American victory at Kwajalein sent shockwaves through Japanese military leadership. 4 days to capture what was supposed to be a major defensive position. 4 days to render months of preparation and fortification irrelevant. 4 days to demonstrate that Japanese defensive doctrine had been completely overtaken by American operational innovation. Admiral Toyoda faced an impossible challenge after assuming command. How do you defend against an enemy that can strike anywhere while bypassing your strongest positions? How do you plan when your plans themselves might be compromised through enemy intelligence? How do you maintain morale among troops who now understand they might be bypassed and left to starve rather than dying gloriously in battle? The answers to these questions proved elusive. Japanese defensive doctrine for the remainder of the war became increasingly desperate. The emphasis shifted from holding forward positions to making every island as costly as possible for Americans to capture. If positions would be bypassed, then they would be provisioned for long-term resistance. If battles would come on American terms, then those battles would be made as bloody as possible. This shift led directly to the horrific battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination to inflict maximum casualties. But even these desperate tactics couldn't change the fundamental strategic reality. Americans controlled the tempo of operations. They chose when and where to fight. They could bypass positions that were too costly to assault. they could apply overwhelming force where they chose to engage. The broader lesson extended far beyond the Pacific theater. The entire concept of linear defensive perimeters, of fortress chains designed to protect strategic depth, had been rendered obsolete by operational mobility and intelligence superiority. If an enemy could bypass your strongest positions, those positions became liabilities rather than assets, absorbing resources and troops while contributing nothing to the actual conflict. Modern military theorists recognize the Marshall Islands campaign as a watershed moment in the evolution of warfare. The shift from attritional grinding through defensive lines to rapid operational maneuver around those defenses became the template for successful military operations thereafter. The German Blitzkrieg had demonstrated the potential of rapid maneuver. The American island-hopping campaign demonstrated how to sustain that operational tempo over vast distances and hostile terrain. The intelligence revolution that enabled island hopping also foreshadowed the central role of information in modern warfare. The captured Z plan gave Americans insight into not just Japanese positions, but Japanese thinking. Understanding how your enemy conceives of the conflict, what assumptions underlie their planning, what they expect you to do, this knowledge became as valuable as any physical weapon. The human element remains the most poignant aspect of this history. Admiral Akiyama wasn't a villain or a fool. He was a dedicated professional officer trying to execute his duties according to the best military doctrine available to him. His tragedy was that his doctrine had been superseded by enemy innovation faster than he could adapt. He prepared for the war he understood and died fighting a war that operated by completely different rules. The thousands of Japanese soldiers who surrendered or died at Kwajalein were similarly victims of strategic obsolescence. They had trained hard, fortified diligently, and prepared psychologically for the battle they expected. When a completely different battle materialized, their preparations became irrelevant. The Korean laborers who found themselves on the front lines of a battle they never expected represent another tragic dimension. Conscripted to build fortifications, they ended up in combat zones without training or preparation. The American victory at Kwajalein demonstrated that warfare had entered a new phase where speed, flexibility, and information could triumph over static defense and martial spirit. This didn't mean courage or dedication were irrelevant. American forces displayed tremendous courage in executing the amphibious assaults. But courage alone wasn't enough. Victory required courage plus intelligence plus innovation plus operational flexibility plus technological superiority plus strategic vision. The Japanese military tradition emphasized individual warrior qualities, spiritual strength, and willingness to die for the emperor. These qualities produced soldiers of exceptional dedication and bravery. But when matched against an enemy that approached warfare as a systematic problem requiring comprehensive solutions, traditional virtues proved insufficient. The aftermath of Kwajalein rippled across the entire Pacific theater. Japanese commanders everywhere began questioning their defensive positions. Every fortified island became a potential trap, a position that might be bypassed and left to wither. Troop morale suffered as soldiers realized they might face not glorious death in combat, but slow starvation on a forgotten island. Supply lines became critical vulnerabilities. Japanese logistics had always been strained by the vast distances of the Pacific theater. Island hopping made those strains catastrophic. When Americans could choose which positions to attack and which to bypass, they could systematically cut supply lines while avoiding the costliest battles. The submarine campaign against Japanese shipping compounded these problems. American submarines began to strangle Japanese logistics, sinking cargo ships and tankers faster than they could be replaced. Bypassed garrisons found themselves not only isolated but slowly starving as supply ships couldn't reach them. The industrial dimension of American warfare also became increasingly apparent. The United States could sustain multiple simultaneous operations across the Pacific while maintaining pressure on all fronts. New ships, new aircraft, new equipment flowed in continuous streams from American factories. Japanese industrial capacity, already strained, couldn't match this production pace. The B-29 raids that became possible after capturing the Marianas represented another application of the bypass strategy. Instead of fighting through every Japanese defensive position to reach the home islands, Americans leapfrogged forward until they could strike Japan directly. Strategic bombing didn't win the war alone, but it demonstrated that Japanese territory itself was vulnerable, that the home islands weren't protected by the defensive perimeter that Japanese strategy had tried to create. The atomic bombs that ended the war represented the ultimate bypass of Japanese military forces. Rather than grinding through the prepared defenses on the home islands, rather than fighting the massive battle that Japanese commanders hoped would inflict such casualties that Americans would negotiate, the bombs struck directly at Japanese will to continue the conflict. But even without atomic weapons, the island-hopping strategy had demonstrated that Japanese defensive doctrine couldn't prevent American advances. Each successful bypass, each ignored fortress, each swift victory at a supposedly defended position reinforced the same message. Japanese strategic thinking had been superseded by American operational innovation. The lessons of Kwajalein remain relevant in contemporary conflicts. The principle of attacking where your enemy is weakest rather than strongest seems obvious in retrospect, but it required revolutionary thinking in 1944. The importance of intelligence, of understanding not just enemy positions but enemy assumptions and expectations, continues to shape modern military operations. The capacity to adapt faster than your opponent, to innovate new approaches when traditional methods prove insufficient, to think beyond conventional wisdom and accepted doctrine, these qualities determined victory at Kwajalein and continue to determine success in competitive endeavors today. For business strategists, the parallels are instructive. How many companies have failed because they assumed competitors would follow traditional patterns? How many market leaders have been disrupted by innovations that bypassed their strengths entirely? The Japanese military's focus on fortress defense, while Americans developed bypass strategies, mirrors countless business examples where established players focused on defending existing positions, while upstarts found entirely new approaches. The psychological dimension deserves continued emphasis. Japanese commanders weren't stupid. They were highly trained, experienced professionals, but they were trapped by assumptions so fundamental that they couldn't question them. The idea that Americans would seek direct confrontation, that enemies would attack where defenses were strongest, that honorable warfare required meeting strength with strength, these assumptions seemed so obviously true that alternatives became literally unthinkable. Breaking free from assumption-based thinking remains one of the hardest challenges in any competitive field. When core beliefs about how competition works, how enemies behave, how markets function become so ingrained that alternatives seem impossible, you've created exactly the vulnerability that cost Japan so dearly at Kwajalein. The storm that killed Admiral Koga symbolizes the larger tempest of change that swept through Pacific warfare in early 1944. Traditional assumptions about naval warfare, about defensive strategy, about the nature of military competition itself were being overturned by operational innovation and strategic creativity. Standing where those battles occurred, walking through the recovered bunkers and examining the rusted gun positions, the human cost becomes tangible. These weren't just strategic concepts or tactical innovations. These were decisions that determined who lived and who died, which young men went home and which became names on memorial walls. The speed of transformation remains striking. In January 1944, Japanese defensive doctrine seemed reasonable, perhaps even strong. By February, it had been exposed as completely inadequate. The gap between perception and reality collapsed in just a few days of combat. For those Japanese officers who survived to see the war's end, the psychological journey must have been profound. Everything they had been trained to believe about warfare, about honor, about how military competition functioned, had proven false. The virtues they had cultivated, the skills they had developed, the strategic frameworks they had mastered, All had been rendered obsolete by an enemy that approached the same problems from completely different assumptions. The American forces who executed the island-hopping campaign weren't superhuman. They made mistakes, suffered setbacks, and faced difficult challenges. But they demonstrated a capacity for innovation and adaptation that proved decisive. When traditional approaches proved too costly, as at Tarawa, they innovated new methods. When enemy defenses seemed impregnable, they found ways around them. When conventional wisdom suggested one approach, they questioned that wisdom and explored alternatives. This capacity for questioning assumptions, for treating accepted doctrine as hypothesis rather than truth, for remaining flexible in the face of unexpected challenges, these qualities enabled American forces to revolutionize Pacific warfare in ways that Japanese forces, trapped by their own traditions and assumptions, could not match. The transformation of warfare from static defense to dynamic maneuver, from fortress warfare to information warfare, from attritional grinding to operational bypass, began in those crucial days at Kwajalein. The principles established there, the innovations pioneered there, the lessons learned there continue to shape military thinking and competitive strategy across all domains. Understanding how the rules changed, why Japanese commanders failed to anticipate that change, and how American forces exploited that failure provides insights relevant far beyond historical military analysis. These lessons speak to any competitive endeavor where assumptions become liabilities, where traditional approaches face innovative alternatives, where speed and flexibility can overcome static strength.